Welcome back. Thank you for staying with the AM report. Well, with the domestic and indeed many global football seasons having recently concluded, this international break not only presents an opportunity to rest, but for many clubs, this is also the time to take stock and bolster their squads ahead of the new season. Now, the transfer window also presents a chance for players nearing the end of their contracts and those seeking greener pastures to make their move. But what are some of the key considerations when such contracts are negotiated, and what are the possible implications of not adhering to the contractually agreed terms? Well, joining me in studio to unpack this subject is FIFA-accredited agent and co-founder of P Management Agency, and also a sports lawyer, Karabo Tshabuse. Karabo, thank you so much for making time for us here on the AM report. And I suppose you're the best person to speak to about this, because 2009, you became the first female FIFA-accredited agent in South Africa. And of course, you've been dealing with a lot of these matters. So during the transfer window, it gets very busy. What are some of the key considerations? If somebody is going, well, a player is trying to move to a different club, or as the club, you're trying to sign on new players, what are some of the things that you, in your experience, have seen to be the key considerations to look out for?
Thanks for having me. Good morning. I don't know if I'm the best person, but certainly 16 years of experience has taught me that really the T's and C's and the nuts and bolts are in the contracts themselves. You know, players are entering fixed-term contracts, and those fixed-term contracts either have options, and those options are often to the clubs to renew. So one of the key things you need to look at is the option provision, what it provides for, what is the money in those option provisions, and can a player really move on, or does he need to be transferred? And transfer, the concept of transfer basically is another club agreeing to sell off their rights to another club for a fee.
And if you're looking at what you've just explained now in terms of, you know, what the contractual stipulations would be, I want to take it a step back.
Okay.
So if you're talking about a player who is a free agent, who's moving, versus a player who needs to transition out of an existing contract to move to the new club, perhaps take us through some of the nuances there and the differences in how those two would be treated.
Yeah, like a free agent has more freedom, essentially. They can enter into a contract as and when they see fit. Now, a contracted player needs to be transferred. And so the key element is consent, because the two clubs can like each other, can like the transfer fee, but the person in the middle might feel that, you know, either the terms are not conducive to what they want, or they don't even want to join that club. But because the two clubs have agreed, you know, he needs to be forced. So consent becomes very key in transfers.
And when you're talking about consent, then you're talking about the consent of the player.
Correct.
In an instance where a player says, well, it's all good and well that you two have agreed, the club and the agent, but I don't want to move for whatever reason. Maybe my family doesn't want to move to this new club. What happens then?
It's a reality that one has to face, and the fact of the matter, if a contracted player does not consent to a transfer, then he stays with his previous employer and possibly on the same terms and conditions that he was in. So he would either need to ask the agent to shop for a better deal or stay with the club that he's in.
And what happens to the existing contract? Because at that stage, perhaps you would assume that the parties have signed, the agent and the club, that is, and they were waiting then for the player to jump on board. So does that contract become binding, or what happens in that instance where there had been a tacit agreement, but it's just a case of perhaps the player not feeling that it's suitable for them?
Yeah, look, he will be bound by the terms of the contract. Oftentimes that contract is for a lesser amount than what is usually on offer. So it would be for him to try and renew and renegotiate better terms. But other than that, if he doesn't want to adhere, he'd be taken to our dispute resolution forums and he'd be sued.
And when then do you consider the transfer to have officially taken place? So when you're saying the transfer has been complete, is that when the parties sign? Is that when the date on which the duties are supposed to resume hits? Or when do you say the transfer has officially now taken place?
When the clearance is out. So there would be two instruments: the transfer agreement between the clubs, the new employment agreement that has to be signed, and when the transfer clearance certificate is issued by the previous employer and lodged by the new employer, the deal is done.
Now, I'm sure you're probably wondering, where are we going with this? Why are there so many contract questions? And I think where we're trying to lead to is where you've been, which is the FIFA Dispute Resolution Chamber and obviously the Court for Arbitration for Sports, where you've sat as well. There are 4 FIFA bans currently active in South Africa, PSL clubs, and one is asking the question then, Why is it that we are seeing such a high prevalence of bans for clubs in South Africa? Your assessment of the situation, are we getting something wrong in the country, or why is it that we are starting to see this upward trend?
We're definitely doing something wrong. Definitely doing something wrong. I think it's twofold, Andy. The first is that, remember, a ban is a disciplinary measure that FIFA is taking, meaning we are not honoring contracts as football clubs. And after it's under 12 bis, Article 12 bis of the FIFA regulations, they give the clubs 30 days to honor obligations, you know. And if they fail to honor, then the player can come back and say, let there be a ban on the club. And that's what happens. And so the first issue is that we're not honoring contracts. The second issue is that there is real financial constraints on clubs, particularly after COVID. They're just failing to honor those contracts. And when you have a player of an international dimension, especially, you can face the FIFA ban left, right, and center. And that's what's happening to the clubs. They're signing these internationals who are either featuring or the contract is just too large for them to honor. They fail to pay and they're taken to FIFA. After 30 days, they face the FIFA ban. So I think because of money and a failure to honor contracts, we're seeing this upward trend in South Africa.
And what then needs to be done to make sure that this does not become a trend that continues? Because we're out saying, well, South Africa is the best league in Africa in the PSL, but that needs to be reflected in how contracts are respected. So if we're seeing this problem now, in your view, what then needs to happen to make sure it's addressed going forward?
I think the first thing is better scouting mechanisms. You know, a lot of the players who transfer bans are now imposed on clubs have not even featured for those PSL clubs. So there's something wrong in the way that we are recruiting and scouting. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, you know, the principle of pacta sunt servanda. You must honor the contract. If you say you're going to pay me 2 million, you best to believe if you don't pay me that, I'm going to come for you. So I think it's a principle of honoring what you can do.
Let's play devil's advocate here for a second, because the other side of the coin that has been brought up is perhaps players then wanting to exploit certain contracts and perhaps use that to make money. I think we've seen a recent incident with TS Galaxy becoming the most recent club to face a FIFA ban. And the chairman of the club, Tim Sukazi, is saying, well, the player had no real intention of honoring the contract because they had not received clearance from their previous club. So there wasn't full disclosure. We acted on information that wasn't fully disclosed to us. And as a result, we now find ourselves foul of FIFA regulations and being slapped with a ban for something that they are arguing perhaps they were not clearly informed about. Is this something that is possible in such a scenario?
It is possible that abuse of process is always a mechanism that players will use. You know, I'm not too familiar with that exact example, but if you're looking at the obligation to get a clearance, that is not necessarily the player's responsibility. It's for the issuing club to get and the club that is releasing to release. FIFA has, you know, the ITC system, which is the international clearance system for clubs of foreign jurisdictions. Now, it's difficult to want to expect a player to get that, you know. So it becomes a bit tricky, but you do see situations where players do abuse the system. And how I've seen it is that they would enter into mutual separation agreements and not want to honor those agreements. And the mutual separation agreement would terminate the employment agreement. But what the player wants to do is then rely on the employment agreement, on the failure of one term in the mutual agreement not being honored, and you can't have that. You can't have your cake and eat it, you know. So oftentimes the club would have to prove that we entered into a subsequent agreement to terminate. That's where the abuse comes in.
And in those instances, then, would it be prudent for perhaps the club to have a suspensive condition that says, well, these are the conditions that need to be met in order for this to be a valid contract, and if you fail on any of these, then we have the right to rescind the contract or even consider it void from the beginning?
I think FIFA will look quite circumspectly on that. You know, what's important is that the contract of certainty is required. So FIFA makes things like medical assessments not part of a contract, that you must pass the medical. When you take a player, it's like footstoots. You take him as it is, you know. So I think what clubs need to do is consult legally in terms of the ambits of where they can go. But once you take a player on contract, you need to live out that contract.
Why is it that this is something that's becoming a bit more contentious with the foreign-based players? As you mentioned, you know, it becomes more about financial constraints, perhaps, if you're looking at transferring players, but also the quota of foreign registered or locally registered players of foreign nationality that a club is supposed to have. Why is it that we're seeing this more prevalent, even in the cases that we're seeing before FIFA with the bans, JDR Stars, Royal AM with Samir Nukovic, this one now with TS Galaxy, and indeed with Richards Bay FC? It's the same thing, where you're having a foreign player that is being signed by a club, and then the club subsequently does not meet the contract.
That's an excellent question. And the answer is simply in that local players, we have our local dispute resolution chambers, the PSL, the SAFA tribunals are competent to resolve those disputes, to give a sanction to the clubs. Now, international players can only go to FIFA, and that's where the attraction of a ban becomes more realizable. And that's why once you sign a foreign player, you inherent risks that are, you know, far-reaching. You know, you have transfer bans that only lift if you live them out, and some of them are like 3 seasons long, or if you pay and you're paying a hefty amount, you know, 1.8 million or those kind of numbers. So unfortunately, it's something that the clubs can't avoid when signing international players.
So what other options or relief mechanisms are available then to those players? Should they perhaps not want to go directly to FIFA? Is there something locally that they can use, or is the PSL dispute resolution chamber only available to our local based players, and the only option that they do indeed have is for FIFA? And if that is the case, why is there then that difference in terms of what they can use at their disposal?
It is indeed the case. They are required to go to FIFA because of the international dimension. South African dispute resolution chambers would not have jurisdiction. And that's because the status and transfer of international players is something that is universally regulated. And so only FIFA can pronounce on, you know, the validity of that transfer, that mutual separation agreement. I think the Ndoro judgment spoke about when we're determining the status of an international player, you go to FIFA. So I think that is the best resolution for international players.
Okay, so let's look ahead now. Of course, we do now know that these 4 clubs have bans that are currently active. And for the most recent one, it's 4 seasons. So in terms of reversing a ban that is already there, what are the mechanisms available? Is it a case of if they pay the money that is outstanding to the player, then the ban can be removed? Or do they have to then exhaust that period, which is, you know, 4 seasons or whatever the case might be, before they are indeed able to sign on new players?
Yeah, you've answered it. You know, it's exactly that. You either pay up what is outstanding in terms of a FIFA award, or you live out the ban, which is 4 seasons. Meaning, and the effect of that is that you can't register new players. You can only release the players. And so you're depleting your squad without an opportunity of recruiting new talent. So the first thing that clubs should do under this ban is just pay up. Because immediately when you pay up, you write to FIFA and the ban is lifted.
Let's wrap things up by you perhaps issuing, I don't want to call it words of advice, but perhaps words of caution to other intermediaries now, because it is a busy time, it's the transfer window. We do expect that a number of contracts are going to be concluded here. So perhaps some cautionary words in terms of what to look out for to ensure that we don't have further FIFA bans for the clubs or even intermediaries who could find themselves in hot water.
Well, with the new dispensation of FIFA agents having been licensed, I think that a word of warning is to intermediaries operating without a license, that we're really coming into a dispensation where you could face sanction for operating without a license. And I think better regulation, more regulation is required. And so I would say, if you're an intermediary without a license, get a lawyer to assist you or a licensed agent to assist you so you don't find yourself in these dispute resolution chambers yourself.